Ma'am, step away from the property. The command cut through the afternoon air so sharply that even the birds seemed to stop singing. Angela Brooks stood frozen on the front porch of her small brick house, one hand still resting on the screen door handle. Then she saw the flashing lights. 3 police cruisers lined the curb in front of her home, their red and blue reflections sliding across windows, parked cars, and neatly trimmed lawns like restless waves. The quiet suburban street in Norfolk, Virginia, had never looked so unfamiliar. Across the road, curtains shifted. A garage door paused halfway open. Neighbors who usually waved and smiled now stood at a distance, watching in silence. Angela slowly stepped onto the porch. The late afternoon sun hung low above the rooftops, painting the sky in shades of gold and pale orange. She had just returned from a 12-hour shift at the hospital. Her scrubs were still wrinkled from a long day spent helping patients, and her feet ached inside worn sneakers. The grocery bag hanging from her wrist felt heavier than it should have. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked calmly. Her voice never rose. She had spent years working in emergency rooms. Remaining calm was second nature. A tall officer standing near the lead cruiser adjusted his sunglasses before taking a few deliberate steps forward. His name badge read Sergeant Brian Walker. "Angela Brooks?" he asked. "Yes. We need you to remain outside the residence while we conduct an investigation." Angela blinked. An investigation into what? Walker did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the other officers positioned around the yard. One stood near the side gate. Another remained by the driveway. The arrangement felt less like a conversation and more like a performance. "We have reason to believe someone connected to an ongoing case may have been here," Walker finally said. Angela frowned. "Connected to what case?" Again, no answer. Angela looked from one officer to another. "Do you have a warrant?" she asked. A faint smile touched Walker's face. It was not a friendly smile. It was the kind people wore when they believed they already held all the power. "Ma'am, cooperate, and this will go a lot smoother." Angela felt dozens of eyes on her. People whose children she had helped during medical emergencies. Elderly residents she checked on after hurricanes. Families she greeted every morning while jogging before work. Yet now no one spoke. No one moved. Walker took another step forward. "Please move away from the house." Angela remained where she was. Not defiant. Not aggressive. Simply steady. "I'm asking a legal question," she said. "Do you have authorization to search my property?" Walker's jaw tightened slightly. Behind him, one of the younger officers shifted his weight uncomfortably. The atmosphere changed. Something invisible settled over the scene like a storm cloud. Angela could feel it. This was no longer about a routine inquiry. Walker folded his arms across his chest. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Angela looked past the flashing lights and saw the elderly woman looked worried. Angela managed a small, reassuring smile. Mrs. Henderson had been her neighbor for nearly 8 years. Last winter, Angela had driven her to dialysis appointments when her son was out of state. Now the woman stood clutching her cardigan, uncertain and frightened. Angela turned back toward Walker. "I just want to understand why my home is surrounded." The question hung unanswered in the air. Walker's expression hardened. More flashing lights reflected across the windows of Angela's house. For the first time, a knot formed in her stomach. Not fear. Something else. The feeling that whatever was happening had started long before she walked up her driveway. And somewhere behind the cold expressions, the unanswered questions, and the growing crowd of spectators, a much larger story was waiting to reveal itself. Angela could feel the weight of the neighborhood pressing against her from every direction, but she refused to let it change the way she stood. The grocery bag still hung from her wrist. A carton of eggs, a loaf of wheat bread, and a container of chicken soup rested inside. Ordinary things from an ordinary day that no longer felt ordinary at all. They turned the familiar entrance into something distant, almost unreal. Yet this house was more than a house. It was the place she had built after years of sacrifice. 8 years earlier, when Angela Brooks first arrived in Norfolk, she had little more than a nursing degree, a used sedan with nearly 180,000 miles on it, and a determination that refused to break. She worked double shifts. She picked up holidays that other nurses avoided. She spent weekends studying advanced emergency care certifications while most people rested. Slowly, paycheck by paycheck, she saved enough money for the small brick home standing behind her. Every room carried a memory. Every wall represented years of effort. The flower bed beneath the front window had been planted with her mother. The oak tree near the driveway had been a sapling when she moved in. Henderson continued watching. A younger couple stood near their mailbox whispering to each other. Angela recognized them immediately. 3 years earlier, she had performed emergency first aid on their son after a bicycle accident. The boy had recovered fully. They had thanked her with a homemade apple pie. Now uncertainty filled their faces. Angela did not blame them. Fear had a way of changing people. One of the younger officers shifted his gaze toward her. He looked uncomfortable, nervous, even. For a brief second their eyes met. Something about that unsettled her more than Sergeant Walker's cold confidence. If this was truly routine, why did everyone seem so uneasy? Walker glanced at a tablet in his hand before looking back at her. Angela knew the feeling well. Before diagnoses, before life-changing moments, she had spent years helping frightened strangers navigate their worst days. Elderly veterans, single parents, children with broken bones, families waiting outside operating rooms. It was a lesson her mother had taught her long ago. Dignity costs nothing, but it can change everything. A soft creaking sound pulled her attention toward the neighboring house. Mrs. Henderson slowly walked closer to the edge of her lawn. Concern lined the older woman's face. Angela offered another reassuring smile. She wanted to tell her everything would be fine. The truth was she wished someone could tell her the same thing. Normally she loved that smell. Walker checked his watch. Then he looked down the road as though waiting for something or someone. Angela followed his gaze. Nothing appeared. Yet the expression on Walker's face told her this scene was only the beginning. Whatever had brought multiple officers to her front yard had not started today. And deep inside, a feeling she could not explain whispered that someone, somewhere, had made her the center of a story she had never agreed to join. The waiting finally ended with the distant growl of an engine. A black city vehicle rolled slowly around the corner and stopped behind the line of cruisers. The door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped out carrying a leather portfolio beneath one arm. Sergeant Brian Walker immediately straightened. The confidence in his posture sharpened. Whatever he had been waiting for had arrived. Angela watched quietly from her porch. The suited man exchanged a few words with Walker before handing him a folder. Walker flipped it open and scanned several pages. The faint smile that appeared on his face told Angela he had just received exactly what he wanted. Walker closed the folder and looked toward Angela again. This time his expression carried a different energy. Not uncertainty, not caution, satisfaction. He climbed the front steps slowly, stopping several feet away from her. Close enough to be heard. Far enough to maintain the appearance of professionalism. "Miss Brooks," he said, "we have additional information." Angela folded her arms gently across her chest. "Then perhaps now would be a good time to explain what this is about." Walker ignored the comment. He opened the folder and removed a photograph. "Do you recognize this individual?" Angela glanced at the image. A middle-aged man with gray hair looked back at her from the photograph. She studied it for several seconds before shaking her head. "No," Walker watched her carefully. "You are certain?" "Yes." He slipped the photograph back into the folder. "Interesting." The word lingered in the air. Angela could sense the neighbors watching every movement, every expression, every pause. A young officer near the driveway looked away awkwardly. The suited man remained beside the city vehicle, observing without speaking. Walker took another measured breath. According to information provided to this department, this individual may have visited this address within the last 30 days. Angela frowned. "That is impossible. How can you be so sure?" Walker asked. "Because I work 12-hour shifts at Norfolk General Hospital. Because I know who comes to my house. Because I have never seen that man before." Walker nodded slowly as if he had expected the answer. "That is not what our information suggests." Angela felt a chill despite the warm evening air. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. Not because they had questions. Questions could be answered. What unsettled her was the certainty Walker seemed determined to display before any evidence had been presented. He had already chosen his conclusion. Everything else appeared secondary. Henderson took a nervous step closer to the curb. The older woman looked as though she wanted to speak, but feared interrupting. Angela appreciated the concern. She also knew there was nothing her neighbor could do. Walker closed the folder once more. "You have built quite a reputation around here, Miss Brooks." The statement sounded almost complimentary. Almost. "People seem to think very highly of you." Angela said nothing. Nurse, volunteer, community advocate. Walker glanced toward the watching crowd. Funny how quickly perceptions can change when new information comes to light. The comment landed heavily. Angela felt the sting behind his words. This was not simply an investigation. It was something else. Something designed to create doubt, to isolate, to make her stand alone even while surrounded by people she had known for years. Yet she refused to look away. Walker expected discomfort, perhaps even fear. Instead, he found only calm determination. The fading sunlight reflected in Angela's eyes as she met his stare. And for the first time since arriving, a small crack appeared in the armor of confidence he had been wearing all afternoon. It lasted less than a second. But whatever game was being played here, Sergeant Walker needed the neighborhood to believe his version of events. And people who possessed the whole truth rarely worked that hard to control the story. The tension that had been building all afternoon finally shifted into something visible. Sergeant Walker lowered the folder and glanced toward the officers stationed around the property. One approached the front gate. Another stepped closer to the driveway. The subtle repositioning transformed the scene once again. Angela could feel the change immediately. The investigation was becoming something more public, more deliberate. Angela tightened her grip on the grocery bag. The plastic handles pressed lightly against her fingers. It was a small detail, but focusing on it helped steady her thoughts. Years in emergency medicine had taught her that when confusion filled a room, the calmest person often saw the clearest picture. Walker turned toward the suited man beside the city vehicle. Whatever they discussed remained hidden. The younger officer near the driveway kept glancing toward her house and then back toward Walker. His expression reflected uncertainty rather than confidence. It was the look of someone following instructions without fully understanding them. That detail stayed with her. "Miss Brooks," Walker said, raising his voice slightly. "For the record, are you refusing to cooperate?" The question caused a ripple through the gathered crowd. Angela heard someone gasp softly across the street. She looked directly at Walker. "I have answered every question you have asked. Then you have nothing to worry about." "If that were true," Angela replied calmly, "you would have explained why my home is surrounded." Walker's jaw tightened again. The answer landed harder than he expected. The entire neighborhood seemed suspended between two realities. The one they had known yesterday and the one unfolding in front of them now. Walker reached into the folder again and removed a single sheet of paper. "Perhaps this will help refresh your memory." He held the page up. Angela could not read the details from where she stood, but she recognized the format immediately. It looked like a visitor log. Names, dates, times. Hospital paperwork had trained her eyes to identify documents quickly. "What exactly am I looking at?" she asked. Walker took a step forward. "Records indicating contact between this address and an individual connected to an active investigation." Angela stared at the page. Then she stared at him. "Records from where?" Walker did not answer. Instead, he folded the paper and slipped it back into the folder. The omission was intentional. Angela knew it. He knew it. The problem was not evidence. The problem was context. Without context, almost anything could be made to sound suspicious. Henderson finally spoke. "Angela has lived here for years," the elderly woman called out. "She is a good person." Several heads turned toward her. Walker offered a polite smile that never reached his eyes. "Ma'am, we appreciate your concern." Then he dismissed her completely by turning away. Angela felt a quiet ache in her chest. Not because of herself, because she saw the hurt in Mrs. Henderson's face. The older woman had simply spoken the truth. A few moments later, one of the officers approached Walker carrying something small in his hand. Angela could not see it clearly. The officer whispered a few words. Walker listened. Then a look of satisfaction crossed his face. The same look Angela had noticed earlier. The look of someone who believed events were unfolding according to plan. He turned back toward her. "Interesting," he said softly. "Very interesting." Angela felt her pulse quicken for the first time all day. Not from fear. From instinct. The same instinct that had warned her countless times in emergency rooms when something beneath the surface was being missed. Something about this entire situation felt manufactured, carefully arranged, like pieces of a puzzle assembled before she ever arrived home. For a brief moment, Angela caught her own reflection in the glass behind her. She saw a tired nurse standing alone on a porch. But she also saw something else. She saw a woman who had spent her life helping strangers through difficult moments. A woman who understood that truth had a strange habit of surviving even the most convincing lies. And as Sergeant Walker watched her from the bottom of the steps, Angela became certain of one thing. Whatever he believed he had found, this story was nowhere near finished. Angela remained on the porch, her posture steady despite the hours that had passed. The grocery bag sat beside the front door now. A vehicle door slammed somewhere behind the cruisers. Angela turned her head slightly and saw another city sedan arriving at the scene. Two men stepped out carrying briefcases. Neither wore a police uniform. They moved quickly towards Sergeant Walker, exchanging greetings that sounded more familiar than professional. Walker accepted a second folder and immediately began reviewing its contents. Whatever was inside appeared important. His confidence visibly increased. The younger officer near the driveway noticed it too. Angela caught him glancing uneasily between Walker and the growing collection of documents. Something about the situation was beginning to trouble him. Walker eventually looked up. "Miss Brooks," he called, "we have obtained additional information linking this address to an individual of interest." Angela folded her hands in front of her. "Then present the information." Walker hesitated. "Just briefly. That is not how this works." "Actually," Angela replied calmly, "that is exactly how truth works." Several people standing nearby exchanged surprised looks. The answer landed harder than any raised voice could have. Walker's expression darkened. Angela could sense the frustration building beneath his composed exterior. He wanted compliance. He wanted uncertainty. Most of all, he wanted her to stop asking questions. One of the men from the sedan approached Walker and whispered something into his ear. Angela could not hear the words, but she saw the reaction immediately. Walker nodded once. Then again, his eyes drifted toward her house, toward the front windows, toward the oak tree near the driveway, toward the porch where she stood. He was looking for something, or perhaps pretending to look for something. The distinction mattered. Henderson slowly lowered herself onto a lawn chair. The elderly woman had refused to go inside. The crowd had grown larger as word spread through the neighborhood. Angela recognized nearly every face. Teachers, retirees, small business owners, people she had known for years, people who now looked confused. Not convinced, just confused. That realization mattered more than Walker understood. Doubt was not the same thing as belief. The familiar notes stirred an old memory. Angela suddenly remembered another evening many years earlier. Another moment when people had rushed to conclusions before learning the full story. Her grandmother used to say that character revealed itself when circumstances became unfair. Anyone could remain calm when life was easy. The real test came when dignity was challenged. Angela inhaled slowly, then exhaled. The memory steadied her. Walker closed the latest folder and climbed one step closer to the porch. "You seem remarkably calm for someone in your position," he said. Angela met his gaze. "Because I know who I am." The answer stopped him cold. For a moment, neither spoke. Walker reached for his phone. He glanced at the screen. Whatever he saw immediately changed his expression. The confidence vanished. Not entirely, just enough for Angela to notice. He turned away and answered the call. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. When it ended, he stared at the dark screen for several moments. The officers remained silent. Angela did not know who had called. She did not know what had been said. But deep in her chest, the same instinct that had warned her all afternoon stirred again. For the first time since the cruisers arrived, Sergeant Walker looked less like a man controlling the situation and more like a man worried that control was beginning to slip away. He lowered his phone slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the screen as if replaying what he had just heard in his mind. The confident posture he had maintained all afternoon was still there, but it now carried a different weight, less certainty and more calculation. Years in emergency medicine had trained her to recognize the smallest changes in human behavior, the tightening of a jaw, the pause before a response, the way eyes stop focusing on the present moment and start searching through unseen possibilities. Walker finally placed the phone back into his pocket and turned toward her again. But he did not speak right away. The suited man near the city vehicle stepped slightly closer, sensing the shift as well. One of the officers near the driveway adjusted his stance, now visibly uncertain. The younger officer who had avoided Angela's gaze earlier now looked directly at Walker, waiting for instruction that did not come. Angela remained still on the porch, not because she was passive, but because she understood something important. Walker finally spoke, but his voice was lower now. Controlled. We are going to take a brief pause in proceedings. The word pause did not match the situation, and everyone present seemed to recognize it. No one moved. No one relaxed. It was not a resolution. It was hesitation disguised as procedure. Angela tilted her head slightly. A pause for what reason? Walker did not answer immediately. He glanced again at his phone, then toward the suited man, then back toward her. Verification, he said finally. The word hung in the air. Verification implied uncertainty. Uncertainty implied error. And error implied that everything that had been built so far might not be as solid as it appeared. Mrs. Someone near the mailbox whispered something that no one repeated aloud. Walker stepped down from the porch slowly, putting distance between himself and her. It was subtle, but it mattered. Authority rarely retreated unless it had been forced to reconsider its position. You will remain here, he said. It was no longer an order delivered with confidence. It was a statement maintaining structure. Angela responded calmly. I have never moved. That answer landed differently than the earlier ones. Not defiant, not emotional, just factual. Walker looked at her for a long moment, then turned slightly toward the officers. The younger officer hesitated before nodding. The suited man checked his watch again, then stepped away from the cruisers, speaking into his own phone in a low voice. Angela watched everything without interruption. It was waiting, and waiting had a way of revealing what urgency could not hide. Angela felt her phone vibrate inside her pocket. She did not reach for it immediately. Instead, she waited. The vibration stopped, then started again. Slowly, she reached inside her scrubs and pulled the device out. The screen lit up with an unknown number. No name, no context, just a single incoming call. She looked up briefly toward Walker, who was now watching her more closely than before. For a brief moment, their eyes locked. Something unspoken passed between them. Not confrontation, not agreement. Something closer to anticipation. Angela answered the call and lifted the phone to her ear. She did not speak first. Then a voice came through, calm but precise, carrying the controlled intensity of someone accustomed to operating under pressure. The voice said her name. And at that exact moment, Sergeant Walker's expression changed again, this time in a way that no longer tried to hide uncertainty. Angela pressed the phone closer to her ear, the soft glow of the screen reflecting faintly against her cheek as the entire street seemed to hold its breath. The voice on the other end repeated her name once more, steady and unmistakably calm, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. Angela did not speak yet. She simply listened. The sound carried a controlled authority, the kind that did not need to raise itself to be heard. Behind her, she sensed rather than saw Sergeant Walker straighten slightly, his attention now fully locked on her reaction. Even the officers nearby had stopped shifting their weight. Everything had narrowed into this single connection between her and the unknown caller. Finally, Angela spoke softly. This is Angela Brooks. There was a brief pause on the line, just long enough to feel intentional. Then the voice responded again, slightly warmer now, but still precise. Angela, this is Marcus Reed. The name triggered something immediate in her memory, not loud or dramatic, but deeply rooted. Years ago, another place, another kind of urgency. She remembered a field hospital, dim lighting, the steady rhythm of emergency care under pressure, and a young man who had arrived broken in more ways than one, refusing to speak, refusing to trust, until she had stayed with him longer than she was required to. Angela's grip on the phone tightened slightly, though her voice remained steady. Marcus, she said quietly. Behind her, Walker's expression changed again. Not confusion now. Recognition. Or at least the beginning of it. He stepped half a pace forward without realizing it. Marcus continued, his tone measured but carrying an unmistakable edge of concern. I just received a notification that law enforcement activity has been initiated at your residence. Angela glanced briefly toward Walker, confirming without words that the situation had escalated beyond what had been presented earlier. Yes, she replied. They are here now. Marcus did not respond immediately. Angela could hear faint background noise on his end, something controlled and structured, like a secure environment rather than a public space. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. Are you safe? The question was simple, but it carried weight. Angela looked around her porch, at the officers, at the flashing lights, at the neighbors standing frozen in place. "I am on my front porch," she said carefully. "I am calm. I am not resisting anything." Walker shifted slightly at those words, as if evaluating how they might sound when repeated later. Marcus exhaled slowly through the line. "Stay exactly where you are," he said. "Do not agree to anything verbally without clarification." Angela did not respond immediately. Instead, she absorbed the instruction. It was not panic. It was structure. It was someone trying to make sense of a situation that had already become complicated. "Marcus," she asked quietly, "what is happening?" There was another pause, shorter this time. When he answered, his voice carried a subtle shift, no longer just concerned but increasingly alert. "Your name was flagged in connection with a case review involving federal consultation records from several years ago." Angela's brow furrowed slightly. "That does not make sense." "I know," Marcus said. "That is why I am here now." Walker, standing a few feet away, clearly caught fragments of the conversation. His jaw tightened again, but this time there was no confidence in it. Only calculation. The suited man near the vehicle had also gone still, watching Walker rather than Angela now. The dynamic had shifted without announcement. Angela lowered her voice. "Marcus, I have done nothing wrong." "I believe you," he replied immediately. That answer mattered more than anything else so far. Not because it cleared her name, but because it introduced doubt into the system that had surrounded her house. Marcus continued, his tone now more deliberate. "I am going to initiate verification protocol on my end. Do not engage further with anyone on site until I confirm details." Angela nodded, even though he could not see it. "Understood." As she lowered the phone slightly, she noticed Walker watching her more closely than before. The earlier confidence he had carried had thinned into something more fragile. Angela spoke one final time into the phone. "Marcus, I am still at my home." "I know," he said. "Stay there. I am coming into this directly." The call ended. Angela lowered the device slowly. Walker studied her face carefully now. The certainty he had displayed earlier had not disappeared completely, but it was no longer unchallenged. Angela met his gaze without speaking. The story unfolding in front of her house was no longer controlled by a single narrative. The moment the call ended, the silence outside Angela Brooks' home felt different. It had shifted into something heavier, something structured, as if invisible hands had begun rearranging the entire situation in real time. Angela lowered her phone slowly, keeping it in her palm instead of putting it away. Sergeant Brian Walker noticed the movement immediately. His eyes followed the device as though it had become the most important object in the entire scene. The suited man near the city vehicle also stepped slightly forward, now no longer observing casually, but paying full attention. For the first time since the officers arrived, Angela felt the direction of control begin to tilt away from Walker. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Walker cleared his throat and spoke carefully. "Miss Brooks, who was that on the phone?" Angela did not answer immediately. Not because she was avoiding the question, but because she was assessing it. The tone of authority Walker had carried earlier had changed. It was still present, but now it felt like it required reinforcement rather than being naturally accepted. Angela finally responded. "A person who requested clarification." Walker narrowed his eyes slightly. Clarification about what? Before Angela could answer, the suited man's phone rang again. He turned away to answer, his posture tightening as he listened. His expression changed within seconds. Whatever was being said on the other end was not routine, not procedural. Walker noticed it too. His attention briefly shifted toward the man, then back to Angela. A sense of fragmentation began forming in the chain of command present at the scene. No one appeared fully in control of all information anymore. The suited man ended his call and immediately approached Walker, speaking in a low, urgent tone. Angela could not hear the words, but she saw Walker's face change as he listened. The shift was small at first, almost invisible. Then it deepened. The confidence that had been present earlier in the day no longer held its original shape. Walker turned slightly away from Angela, speaking back to the man in a tone that was now less authoritative and more restrained. Angela stood quietly on her porch, observing without interruption. The younger officer near the driveway looked increasingly uncomfortable, shifting his gaze between his supervisor and the house as if trying to determine which version of reality he was supposed to follow. After a long moment, Walker turned back toward Angela. His expression was controlled, but the tension beneath it was now visible. "We are adjusting the scope of this interaction," he said carefully. The phrase was deliberate. It avoided clarity while sounding procedural. Angela tilted her head slightly. "Adjusting in what way?" Walker hesitated for the first time since arriving. It was brief, but it mattered. "We are awaiting confirmation from higher authority," he replied. That statement changed the atmosphere again. The officers who had been positioned around the property no longer moved with certainty. Their stance had shifted from enforcement to observation. The suited man stepped away from Walker, continuing another phone call, his voice lower now, more controlled but increasingly urgent. Angela felt a strange stillness settle over her. Not fear, not relief, something closer to suspension, as if the situation had been lifted out of one system and placed into another without warning. Walker finally spoke again, but his voice had lost its earlier edge. "Until confirmation is complete, no further action will be taken." The words were simple, but their meaning was significant. Nothing about the scene had resolved, yet everything had paused. Angela studied him carefully. "So I am not being detained." Walker shook his head once. "No, and my home is no longer being searched." Another pause. "That is correct." The admission, though careful, shifted everything. Angela slowly stepped back toward her front door, not because she had been told to move, but because she was reclaiming space that had been occupied without clarity. Walker did not stop her. None of the officers did. Henderson exhaled softly, as if she had been holding her breath for hours. Angela reached the doorframe and placed one hand on it, steadying herself. The house behind her remained unchanged. The same walls, the same light filtering through the windows. Yet everything around it had transformed. The presence of uncertainty had replaced the certainty that had been imposed earlier. Walker looked toward his team, then back at Angela. For the first time, his voice softened slightly, not in apology, but in recalibration. "We will remain in the area until instructed otherwise." Angela nodded once. "That sounds appropriate." The response was calm, neutral, and without hostility. Yet it carried weight. Walker did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward the street, toward the suited man still speaking into his phone, toward the officers now waiting without direction. The structure he had built earlier in the evening was no longer stable. Something outside of his control had entered the equation. And for the first time since arriving, Sergeant Walker was no longer certain that he was the one defining what would happen next. Angela Brooks stood at the threshold of her front door, one hand resting lightly against the frame, her presence steady even as everything around her continued to shift without warning. Sergeant Brian Walker had stepped slightly away from the porch now, no longer occupying the same space of certainty he had carried earlier in the evening. The officers remained in position, but their movements had slowed into stillness, each one waiting for instructions that no longer seemed clear or immediate. The suited man who had been making repeated phone calls finally ended his last conversation and walked toward Walker with a different posture than before. There was no urgency now, only resolution. Angela could not hear every word, but she saw Walker's reaction instantly. His shoulders tightened. His gaze shifted toward the ground for a brief moment before returning upward, as if recalibrating what he had just been told. Moments later, 2 additional vehicles arrived without sirens, moving slowly as if they were entering a space already defined by caution rather than enforcement. The doors opened and individuals stepped out with an entirely different presence than the officers already on site. One of them approached Walker directly. The conversation that followed was brief, but it carried a finality that altered the atmosphere completely. Angela watched without moving. Years of experience had taught her that real conclusions rarely announced themselves loudly. Walker listened, then nodded once. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. When he turned back toward Angela, something fundamental had changed in his expression. The earlier confidence was gone, replaced by a controlled neutrality that no longer attempted to dominate the situation. He stepped forward slowly, stopping at the base of the porch. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice now even and restrained, "this matter has been reviewed at a higher level." Angela did not respond immediately. She simply waited. Walker continued, "There is no active cause for concern regarding your residence or your involvement." The words were precise, but they carried weight. Angela studied him carefully. "And the reason for all of this?" she asked. Walker hesitated, then spoke. With careful clarity. There was a misalignment in the initial information received. The phrasing was deliberate. It avoided blame while acknowledging error. Angela nodded slightly, absorbing the meaning without emotion. Behind Walker, the officers began to relax their stance. One by one, they lowered their attention from the house. The suited man near the vehicle closed his folder and stepped back, signaling an end to coordination. A door closed softly. Walker remained where he was for a moment longer. You will not be contacted further regarding this incident unless additional verification is required through proper channels. Angela looked at her home behind her. The warm light inside was still on. Nothing had changed within its walls, yet everything surrounding it had been temporarily rewritten. She turned back to Walker. I hope that verification process includes accuracy next time, she said calmly. There was no anger in her voice, only clarity. Walker accepted the statement without argument. Understood, he replied. A brief pause followed. Then he stepped aside, signaling his officers to begin withdrawal. The movement was orderly, controlled, and noticeably different from their arrival. No one rushed. No one lingered unnecessarily. Angela remained at her door as the presence that had filled her neighborhood slowly dissolved. Henderson finally stood, placing a hand over her chest, as if steadying herself after a long period of tension. She looked toward Angela and offered a small, relieved nod. Angela returned it gently. Sergeant Walker paused one final time near the edge of the driveway. For a brief moment, he looked at Angela not as a subject of investigation, but as a person who had remained steady through something that had not been steady at all. Then he turned and walked back toward his vehicle. The engine started, and slowly, one by one, the remaining cars followed. No explanations were offered beyond what was necessary. Angela stepped fully inside her home and closed the door behind her. The lock clicked softly, final and grounding.